what would you say to the people who are like, well, I want, universal programs and the expansion of public goods just as much as the next guy, but Americans are too racist to ever go for anything like that. I mean, I think that's a kind of like classic criticism that we hear time and time again. And I just want to quickly mention Heather McGhee, who is the former president of Demos. She has a new book out now where she sort of makes that claim. Let's see. Yeah, she recently wrote an article for the New York Times, "The Way Out of America's Zero-Sum Thinking on Race and Wealth," and it part of it is an appeal to, again, like I say, the expansion of public goods. But her argument is that white Americans sort of decided to forfeit that during the civil rights period, when it seemed like Black Americans were going to have a share in that bounty. And like I say before, this is a classic thing that we've heard about America all the time, that it's just too racist for social democracy.
I heard this on a Freakonomics podcast like 2 weeks ago.
So there you go. So Touré, like, do you have any, like, what is your response to that? And or is there any basis to that argument?
I can say that there is a basis to the argument, but I'll tell you what my response is before I get back to the basis. My response to it is this: if white Americans are too racist to embrace the very kinds of policies that they would benefit from, then they're gonna support reparations. Why? Right? I mean, so that doesn't make any sense on its own terms. And in fact, the irony is, I think it's a lot more cynical, potentially, to say that if you want to grow the ranks of the Black middle class, you have to nurture a buy-in from whites, which would mean that whites the best buy-in would not be soothing their souls for, sins that technically they couldn't have been responsible for, right? Because nobody alive today knows anybody who owned a slave in the antebellum period, right? So, nobody alive today actually is responsible for that. You can say that their ancestors were. That's fine, but that ends up being a profoundly illiberal framework if you hold people alive today responsible for the misdeeds of their great grandparents or whatever, right? So again, I mean, the idea that you can't make the case for universal programs because white people are too racist to support programs that they would benefit from. So instead, and I'm not saying that this is what Heather McGhee argues, but this is what someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates had argued. So instead, what you have to focus on is redistributed programs that only 13% of the population could hope to benefit from. Doesn't make mathematical sense at all. Because you need a coalition in a democratic state to achieve those policy ends. And since Black people are only 12.8% of the total population, and Blacks are in fact overrepresented among the poor and working class, that 13% is going to lose every single time in a democracy, right? The element of truth, or I should say the basis, I believe, of that claim as that McGhee makes, that in the civil rights movement or in the immediate aftermath of the civil rights movement, you could see a white backlash. I think the thing that's often overlooked with that claim, because there certainly is a backlash of sorts, is that it just so happens that the civil rights movement achieved its last major victory last major legislative victory. The Civil Rights Act of 1968, we're going to say, is the last major legislative victory, about 15 years into deindustrialization. And then it just so happens that a few or so years, several years after that last major victory, we have, economic crisis, right? I mean, we have stagflation and the oil crisis, and the system's starting to fall apart. And one of the contributors to the, animus, the racial animus of that time period is the inability, is actually, I think, the collapse of the Keynesian consensus, right? It's not that white people just have these sensibilities that they're just dogmatically attached to, but that backlash in that framework around the civil rights movement. And the worst of that backlash occurs as the system is falling apart and its ability to deliver for the masses of Americans, the masses of white Americans, is starting to, be in serious doubt, right? Because of the rubber meeting the road and the like. So you got that going on as one of the factors. The other thing, another thing, as you move the historical meter up just a little bit, and I think it's, I think sometimes we're not altogether clear about where this backlash, elements of this backlash are coming from, is this. I mean, if you think about this moment now, what we have is a kind of, what's the best way to put this? And I have to think about how to put this, partly because of the Twitterverse. But if you think about this moment that we're living through right now, what we have is a discourse of starkness all the way around. And the reality of the situation is that Republicans have long treated, I would say, for the most part, quite disingenuously, anti-discrimination policies as evidence of white displacement, right? Diversity, affirmative action predates the diversity framework, of course. The diversity framework comes about, sometime after about 1978. But at this point, affirmative action and diversity are interchangeable. And again, and this is an awkward thing to say, and it's awkward for me to say as a defender, and I would say a fairly ardent defender of affirmative action. Nevertheless, that discourse of diversity has been equated, and I'll no longer make this passive voice. Conservatives had long equated affirmative action with white displacement. And the fact that affirmative action comes online in a real serious way around the time that we have this kind of economic collapse, right? The economic crisis in the 1970s only amplifies these sentiments that I was talking about. And of course, you can fast forward, as I meant to do a minute ago, our historical meter to where we are now. That hasn't changed that much, right? I mean, and in fact, in some ways, at this very moment, the diversity discourse has become more crass. So again, this is an awkward thing to say, so I apologize for, biding my time and all of the emoting that's happening. I can't help myself. But it's kind of hard not to hear in this very moment the reparations discourse in this very moment that's characterized by precarity for not just Black Americans, not just Hispanic Americans, but also white Americans, is kind of tone deaf. Mm-hmm. And I could take the kind of out. How do I say to somebody who actually has lost, how do I say to a white person who's lost his or her job, right, and doesn't have health insurance and is fretting every day that he or she may, contract this potentially deadly coronavirus? How do I say to them, from my position as a Black tenured professor, you really are benefiting from that white privilege, right? I mean, and where's my check, right? Because you're the privileged one, not me, right? And look, privilege comes in many forms. And that, of course, is baked into the privilege discourse. But at this point, it seems that the only privilege that we are committed to is racial privilege, right? And maybe gender-based privilege, without appreciating the fact that there is this thing called class privilege out there. And that while working one's way up, if you're a Black person, irrespective of sex, or a woman, irrespective of race, as you move up the income ladder, you gain privilege. That doesn't mean that you don't experience racism or sexism. Of course you will, right? I mean, that is what it is in this moment. But how you experience racism or sexism plays really differently depending on where you are often enough in the queue. It may not prevent you from being profiled by the police if you're a Black person, right? If you're a Black person who is in a predominantly white neighborhood or whatever, and the police decide that you don't belong there because you're a Black person in a predominantly white neighborhood, they may not notice that you're nicely dressed and that you've got this fancy car that doesn't have the spinning rims and the light package, but you have the respectable version of this luxury SUV or sports sedan or whatever, and the racist cop might not notice it. But when you look at the inmate population, it's pretty clear what role class plays in how we experience the criminal justice system, right? Because there's most of the inmate population across racial lines is comprised of poor people, right? Mm-hmm. Poor and working class people. There are very few college graduates in prison. They're there, but there are very few of them. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But one of them is, beyond the fact that middle class and certainly upper class people are a lot less likely to perpetrate violent crimes and property theft, right? Because those correlate. That happens. Obviously, I watch Discovery ID, so I know that violent crimes transcend class. But in the aggregate, the mass wave of violent crimes is comprised disproportionately by young men who are poor, right? And the like. So what you find, though, again, is that middle class people, among other things, are A, less likely to commit those kinds of crimes. B, they're a hell of a lot more likely to be able to afford what one of my favorite characters from The Wire would call a pay lawyer. And being able to afford competent legal representation can make a huge difference in outcomes. It might bankrupt you, but it can actually keep you out of prison. But the point is that even if Black people up and down the class ladder experience racism, they don't experience it all the same way. And I said on a previous Jacobin related or Michael Brooks related interview, I referenced Oprah's handbag controversy from 2013, I think, and maybe it was in Denmark, where Oprah couldn't buy the $38,000 handbag.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And people got mad at me about that. I mean, I don't usually read chats, because I don't hate myself that much. Or maybe I do, I just don't hate myself that way. I think that's, but when I was glancing through the chats, people got some people were pissed off about it and insisting that this was evidence of systemic racism, right? Because Black people up and down the class ladder all experience racism. Yeah. If you don't think I fucking knew that, figured that out when I was 15, let's say, in the back of that squad car on my way home, then you're out of your mind. I know that in a lived experience kind of way. And in fact, it's precisely because of my own intimate knowledge with this experientially that I appreciate the role of class in mitigating this damage. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I'm going to beat this dead horse just for the YouTube and Twitter crowd. I didn't shed a tear that Oprah couldn't buy that $38,000 handbag at that store, right? It was clearly an expression of racism. There's no question about that. Was her life impacted negatively by that, though? Right? I mean, that was a humiliation of sorts. And what happened was Oprah was misidentified as a Black person who wasn't Oprah. She was misidentified as a Black person who couldn't afford that handbag, which is like almost all of us. Right?
Yeah, the non-Oprahs of the world.
But again, did that prevent Oprah from living her life the rest of that day, having a good day perhaps, and being able to afford a $38,000 handbag at purchase from another retailer who wasn't a racist jerk? No. But how many people in that era, and I said this previously, that handbag cost almost as much as I think the median household income for a Black family of four. And what was outrageous about it, and I didn't say this in that previous interview, is that in that moment, the racist indignity that Oprah experienced became emblematic of all of the problems of Black Americans. And I'm sorry, that is not emblematic of the problems that Black Americans face, right? That's emblematic of the problems that Black multimillionaires face, is what that is. And good luck, being a middle-class person, trying to buy a $38,000 handbag.
Mortgage your house, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh,
Oh.
sorry.
No, just to go off what you were saying earlier about tone deafness. I mean, I think that is a really good way of putting it, because something that struck me when, looking at the ongoing affirmative action debate is, you've been very clear, I think, on the Jacobin channel in the past, about the sort of labor and New Deal roots of affirmative action. But I think that the way that it's kind of transformed at this point is, as you say, now it's sort of synonymous with diversity. But I think another thing is happening, which now affirmative action is sort of seen as a way to diversify elite institutions, right? So like all of this affirmative action talk is concentrated, is pretty much about Ivy League universities, or like in the case of California, they had a ballot initiative last year. I think it was Proposition 16, which was about reinstating affirmative action, both for public employment and for public education. But the way that the Democratic elite, who all supported the measure, came out swinging for it was, again, this rhetoric of diversity. And it was very much about, we need to diversify elite institutions. And at a time when college tuition is like through the roof and nobody can afford it, to me, that just, again, seemed very tone deaf. It seemed, I mean, as you've pointed out before, that's not what affirmative action was originally intended to do, diversify elite institutions, but also at a time of extreme economic inequality. And when it comes to colleges, like no one can afford college. It just, how can you get people to care? And in California, I just want to say, people didn't, I don't want to say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say people didn't care, but that ballot measure did not pass. A majority of Californians voted it down. And I want to add that I think a significant number of non-white people, Latinos and Asian Americans, and I think, not insignificant number of Black Californians voted it down as well. So.
Well, one thing that was striking about Prop 16, and I think Prop 16 is the clearest expression of the problem that any reparations project would face, is that, and I say this as, again, one who defends affirmative action. I embrace it. I understand myself to be a beneficiary of it directly and indirectly through my parents, who had opportunities that they were certainly qualified for. But prior to the genesis of affirmative action, because they're Black people, they wouldn't have had access, right, to those same opportunities. But what was really kind of striking about the language in Prop 16 was that, and this would have implications for a reparations project, is that the language of the referendum actually reflected the right's take on what affirmative action was. Because if I can't remember the exact wording, but it was, it described affirmative action as preferential treatment for minorities. And that's not really what affirmative action is. That is, again, the right's characterization of what affirmative action is. Preferential treatment for minorities is not exactly what affirmative action is, but it is exactly what reparations is, right? And in keeping with your point, Jen, you're right. I mean, I think it was like 55% of whites had voted against Prop 16. The majority of Asian Americans had voted against it, and even a slim majority of Hispanics. And what was striking, one other element to this story, is that just in, I think it was September maybe of 2020, the California governor of California and the legislature had moved ahead to authorize a reparations committee. So in September, they authorized a reparations committee, right, to investigate, the feasibility of reparations or whatever. And then in November, a ballot initiative that would have reinstated affirmative action in California failed. A ballot initiative that described affirmative action as preferential treatment for minorities, which really isn't exactly what it is. Now, I think it's true that a lot of the discourse centered on affirmative action coalesces around what you might describe maybe broadly as elite spaces, because it's not just Ivy League universities, though that's the star of the show, right? I mean, that's the right-wing groups that challenge affirmative action really center on, the Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanfords of the world, right? But, even at public universities, there's a push to diversify. And at the university where I teach, for example, which is hardly an elite university and has a kind of class heterogeneous student body, we are chronically engaged in diversity projects. Some better than others. I mean, I embrace many of our diversity projects, and I'm circumspect about others. But nevertheless, it goes beyond elite institutions, even if they are the focus. The thing that's worth noting, though, is I think a lot of people tend to not appreciate the way that affirmative action opened up opportunities for Blacks, not just, to become doctors and lawyers, but actually it opened up opportunities for Blacks to get good jobs at the municipal level, right? To get jobs as police officers and firemen and the like. And of course, not just Black and brown people, irrespective of sex, but women irrespective of race. So there's a stretch of kind of blue collar jobs that opened up because of affirmative action. But in origin, and Jen, you alluded to this previously, so I'm just going to state it explicitly. Affirmative action was conceived as a kind of anti-poverty program, right? I mean, it was bound up essentially with the war on poverty. And what the end game was, I should say, anti-discrimination measures were conceived as anti-poverty initiatives. And in that era, the presumption of the 1960s, one of the major presumptions was that among the principal impediments that Blacks faced in their quest for upward mobility was racial discrimination. And in fact, policymakers tended to downplay, ironically, they tended to downplay the disproportionate effects of automation and urban deindustrialization on Blacks, but certainly were keenly aware of the impact of racial discrimination and what they would have described as the cultural impediments, these soft and hard skills set gaps that hobble Blacks in their quest for upward mobility. But affirmative action did actually open up opportunities for Blacks in the working class. The problem is, though, one more time, that the game changed, right? If the U.S. economy still were characterized today by an expanding middle class, and this is the key point, so I'm going to repeat it. If the U.S. economy were today still characterized by an expanding middle class, then, anti-discrimination measures would be a reasonable fix alone, right? And as I say in Toward Freedom, had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 68 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 been passed in 1940, we probably wouldn't have the racial disparities that we have today, right? But the problem is that they were passed those important pieces of legislation were enacted, as I said a while back, about 15 years at the latest into, deindustrialization, and then just ahead of the collapse of the Keynesian consensus. So we just have to acknowledge that the game has changed, and, it's a harder fight, right? Because it's a harder fight because what's necessary is real structural change. And I don't mean structural change, obviously, the way that Robin DiAngelo means it, by way of anti-racism training, because that is not a structural change. That is an individualist solution or fix to a societal, structural, systemic problem. But the key systemic problem that we face is, low wages, right? Decades of depressed wages that are owed to a variety of things, from the declining union movement to trade policy and a host of other issues, right? So the depressed wages and the housing crisis that is before us, and I mean the moderate income housing crisis that is before us, that really is likewise the result of some structural change. Like gentrification, what people call gentrification, is easily understood as white displacement of Black people. And certainly if you live in a community like I did 10 years ago in Northwest DC, you can feel it that way. But that's not really what it is, right? Because in many of these communities, like in Northwest DC, it's not that upscale white people are displacing, Black and Hispanic people. It's that upscale people who can afford the property taxes that municipalities from the Bay Area all the way to Boston and DC and all points in between that those municipalities want to levy, right? Because they're not going to tax the businesses. That these rich people are courted into it. Municipalities are courting rich people to move to these once moderate income, even as well as low income, majority Black and brown communities. But many of these now upscale gentrified communities are actually quite diverse, right? Because Northwest DC is really very diverse. Hyde Park is a different matter, but Hyde Park is really diverse, actually, along racial lines, but not so much along class lines, right? So, I mean, you need real structural reform in labor markets and housing markets. And unfortunately, anti-racism training, maybe if you can afford to live there and you're Black, will make a better white neighbor. I think it would make a more annoying white neighbor, though, from what I've seen, right? Because so much of at least the anti-racism training that I've sat through, I don't know about you guys, was worthy of, Miss Morello from Everybody Hates Chris, right? I mean, if you know that character, she's my favorite go-to for this. Or the Craig character from season 1 of Atlanta, that what the anti-racism training often enough insists upon is that we respect each other's, group culture. And my God, how could 42 million Black Americans have the exact same cultural frameworks, right? Yeah. And there's 200 something million white Americans. How would they all have the same cultural frameworks, right? I've lived in the South, the Northeast, and the Midwest, and it's all different, right? I mean, we all speak English and enjoy varying takes on pizza, some better than others, but nevertheless, there are pronounced cultural differences within these regions. And in fact, just to amplify this point, and this relates to something Ariel said a while back, one thing that I and many other Black people who are not native to Central Illinois, where I have lived for about 19 years now, have been instantly struck by. And for me, from moment one, but every Black person I've known from Chicago who's moved down here has had the same experience, is how many white people in this community are part of multiracial families. When I think of, and it was something I never expected, right? Because I certainly had my Northeast corridor biases about flyover country. I loved Chicago, but I'm about 120 miles south of Chicago. So I was like, I don't know about living, in corn country. And I've enjoyed it, actually. So turns out I was really ignorant and provincial, like many people from the New York metro area. They just don't understand that they're provincial. But I was really stunned to see as many multiracial families as I've seen locally. I don't know if that's the best commentary on people's politics, right? Because many of these people are still conservative, but it does make clear that there's a racial fluidity, right? And not just in the boxes that people check. There's that, which we've touched upon, but even as how people who some of us might cast as racist, it's actually kind of complicated with them, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I'm always struck by the oversimplified barriers that people put in place, right? Where they act in presuming that these are kind of naturally existing organic categories. It almost sometimes seems like people are talking about different species and then generalizing within the species. It's extremely creepy. But the other thing that I think is notable is, in my experience, having dealt with like some pretty staunch white racists, people who are like, I am racist, they don't think of it just as a matter of animus. Like, I remember when I was a kid, we lived in the projects, and my dad was like an elected representative of one of the people who lived in the projects. And they're supposed to bring complaints and issues to the housing board. And our neighbor was upset that a Black man had this job. And he was like, this is for us. This is our benefit and you shouldn't get it. And he was like, I'm in the Klan. I have a gun. let's settle this. My dad was like, you think I'm scared? Like, I'm from Virginia. So this was in Maine. He was like, you want to talk about you want to talk about the Klan? Okay, let's talk about the Klan. I do remember him being like, you idiot cracker, you're supposed to cover your face. But this man, is part and parcel of a group of people who see racism as an economic platform that answers and meets their needs. They also see it as a way to, potentially meet high-ranking people in their communities, right? Like sheriffs, mayors, particularly the Klan of the 30s. These things are not simply people going like, I want to be mean to some Black people. When you talk to racists, they are articulating an economic program, and it's one that's segregationist. And the failure to actually understand that and then meet that with broad economic programs that integrate people, it's exactly what you're talking about. Like, if people aren't going to support universal programs because they're racist, why would they support reparations? Why is that the tact we're taking?
No, and the 1 year of my 20s that I wasn't in school, I'd worked as a permanent temporary employee. My second job, which I liked, was with the Orleans Parish Sewage and Water Board. And as unsatisfying jobs go, that was a really enjoyable job. I love my coworkers. My first job, though, I worked for a company that did paper management for a major oil company. And while my coworkers were all individually very nice to me, a lot of them, were people that I would have described as racist, right? And if only because my immediate coworkers in the subunit that I worked in, I think most of them had voted for David Duke. And if you voted for David Duke, I think that qualifies you as, some kind of a racist, right?
I think you get a card that says, I am a racist, if you do.
I'm a card
in the mail.
Racist. That's right. Because, he was the Reese's peanut butter cup of white supremacists, blending the Klan and the neo-Nazi movement all in one. But what was interesting about these individuals was there were a couple of things that were interesting about it, apart from the fact that they were, pleasant to me, which was really frustrating, because what that meant was they actually shared their views about the world with me, which pissed me off and made it very difficult to go to my job, which I needed. So I had to bite my tongue a lot, but not every single time. That none of them understood themselves to be racist. And I thought that was perplexing, right? Because as we've already touched upon, if you voted for David Duke, you've just announced this, right? And yet they would say, no, people insist that people who voted for David Duke, the Duke supporters, are racist, but we're not. They would tell me, and I was like, go figure. And of course, it was always the classic exchange that I'm not a racist, but, and then everything that comes out of your mouth announces that you really are. And so there was that. But again, that drove home to me that even in the early 1990s, when this was, people who voted for David Duke understood that being a racist was being a bad person. And they disassociated themselves from their own worldview, which again was really fascinating. But the other thing that jumped out at me was, and at this company, this was, clerical work. It was gendered. There were only a couple of dudes that worked there, so it was mainly women. And while my unit was predominantly white, I think most of the staffers were Black. The other thing that jumped out at me was that my white coworkers, and we made, I don't know, $1 more than minimum wage or something like that. Generally speaking, at least in my subunit, did not understand themselves to be poor. And it was striking because I'd said something, this was around the 1992 presidential election, about the importance of raising the minimum wage. And I referenced what we made. And I said, if you make, whatever we made at the time, which again was $1, maybe $1.50 more than minimum wage, you're broke. Because I knew I couldn't afford anything. So it's a good thing New Orleans was really cheap then. But anyway, and my white coworkers looked at me like I was crazy. So you're trying to, and literally one of them said, are you trying to say I'm poor? I'm saying on this little ass money we make, we can't buy anything. So that might imply that we're poor. But interestingly enough, I think to a person, when I had versions of the same exchange with my Black coworkers, didn't faze them. right? And for a lot of people who are white, and this I think is a facet of what you're saying, Ariel, that whiteness is a kind of psychological insulation against poverty because we racialize poverty in this country, right? But that's not a good thing in ways that many of us who are leftists don't appreciate. They're not born understanding, with a racialized understanding of poverty. They, like we are, have been trained to see racism in that way, to see poverty, view poverty through a racialized lens. And that actually highlights the work that race does on a kind of divide and conquer project, right? And it's fascinating to watch people who understand themselves to be progressives co-sign this narrative by insisting that all white people are privileged, including those who don't have health insurance and make $1 more than minimum wage or just the minimum wage, right? And that all Black people are disadvantaged, including those who can afford to buy a $38,000 handbag, assuming that the racist clerk lets them buy it, right? But that's doing the devil's work, right? That's the kind of framework that tells these, people who might have voted for Obama twice and then decided to vote for President Trump in 2016, that maybe the left doesn't care about them, right? And a presidential candidate who's a game show host who's modeled himself on a 1980s or early 1990s racist shock comic really does care about them, even though, as Howard Stern said, if you just look at the images at Mar-a-Lago, it's really clear that he doesn't, but it makes it a more compelling sell, right? That for him, it makes it easy for him to sell himself or some other person like him down the line, let's say, as a champion of the little guy, when in reality, this guy who, expresses actually empathy for them, for this, pissed upon population in much the same way that Rush Limbaugh did. In reality, this guy actually was an even bigger antagonist to their class interests, chipping away, let's say, at the NLRB in the way that President Trump actually did, right? So if you're a trade unionist and care about that money you're able to make because of the union contract, Trump was way worse than Obama. And certainly it looks like he'll be substantially worse than Biden. But if you're also that trade unionist, you know that Obama screwed you. And you know that Obama screwed you with the ACA, right? Because if the ACA had been fully implemented, the ACA would have bankrupted those great Cadillac health insurance programs that many unionists have. And it would have undermined your livelihood, right? Just like the TPP would have undermined your livelihood. So that all sets the stage for the charlatan or the Pied Piper of racial animus or whatever you want to call them, to snap those people up. I get what the partisans are doing, right? What the paid staffers are doing, because that's their job, right? They want to divvy up the vote in these ways that ultimately don't challenge hegemony. But those of us who aren't paid staffers, right? Those, like anybody who's a leftist, like how could we be paid Democratic staffers, let's say? Why would we co-sign this narrative that just says to these hard scrabbled types, yeah, we don't give a shit about you, right?
And also protect your privilege. It's the only thing you have. It makes a white supremacist argument that says, listen, you may not have much, but what you do have is because of your white privilege. So all of these hardships and issues that you've faced, whatever you could scrape by is because of white privilege. And it's persuasive in exactly the wrong way. If people are already on your side and they're not racist, then you don't really have to employ the kind of like guilt, repentance machinery of privilege ideology. If they're not, you have wrapped up with a bow a case for why white supremacist economic policies will benefit them and are the best thing for them to invest their time in. On that note, we don't have time for a lot of questions, even though somebody asked if the show could be 5 hours long, and now that's how I feel, except I have to put my kids to bed. I wanted to ask you about this kind of persistent, sticky idea that the New Deal was racist. And you tackle this in Towards Freedom. So if anybody wants to know more about this, I would urge you to buy this book and read it all the way through. I've seen this quite a bit. It's floated in some conversations about reparations. People cite this as a moment where income inequality and strides towards that failed Black people, right? And these programs failed Black people. And sometimes that's nested in, similar criticisms of Jim Crow policy and saying we need reparations for years of this. It's not just about slavery. It's about this persistent legacy in America of leaving Black people out of these economic gains. And that's extended towards critiques of the New Deal and its policies. So could you go into if it's racist, answer it once and for all on air, and what are the origins of that idea?
So let's say it's complicated, but the idea that the New Deal was intrinsically racist and that Black people didn't get anything out of it is weird and is something that's gained a lot of traction really only in the last 5 or 6 years, right? You could see, there at least it gained a lot of traction with people on the left in the last several years, since about 2016 or maybe 2015. One of the things that's weird about it, I'll handle by way of a question, or at least an anecdote related to a question. Since we've had this disposition to insist that the New Deal was racist and that Black people didn't get anything out of it, I have begun in the last couple of years asking my students, or anytime I do a public speaking event with a live audience that I can actually interact with, which obviously has been a little while, but even some Zoom audiences, when Blacks left the Republican Party for the Democratic Party. And what's been really interesting to me in the last year or two that I've asked this question is, so far, excluding people who are my former students from the mix anyway, and of course scholars, I'm batting 1,000 that when I ask the question, nobody gets it right. And the answer to the question is the 1930s, right? 1936. And the question, as I frame it, is in national elections. And what I've been getting from people in the last couple of years is, the 60s, right? They'll say the Great Society or Barry Goldwater, which is an interesting one. And that's not right, but I get the logic of that because then the Black vote in national elections by the 60s moves 85% plus Democratic from like 70 or 75% plus Democratic. But I've been getting, again, in the 60s, I've gotten the 80s, I've gotten, which is weird, I even got the 20s, but nobody's saying the 1930s. And again, it makes sense in a context in which everyone insists that the New Deal was racist and that Black people didn't get anything out of it. But the reality is, of course, that Blacks left the party of Lincoln for the party of Roosevelt in the 1936 presidential election, right? And Roosevelt captured 70+% of the Black vote in 36, whereas the Republican had captured 70+% of the Black vote 4 years earlier. And the rest is literally history from there. So the reality is that Blacks actually did benefit from the New Deal, and Black Americans understood themselves to be beneficiaries of New Deal policy. And they made that understanding plain by voting for Roosevelt and then Truman after him, right? And what gets lost, though, I guess what happens is that in this moment, we tend to conflate sort of disproportionality with totality. And while Blacks were overrepresented, Blacks certainly benefited from New Deal relief programs. In some instances, they benefited from New Deal relief programs in percentages greater than their share of the total population. So about 20% of Blacks actually received welfare, New Deal welfare, during the New Deal on average. And that is huge because Blacks are about 10% of the total population. So that's 100% overrepresentation in welfare among welfare recipients writ large. In relation to blacks' needs, though, blacks did not receive relief equivalent to their needs, right? Because blacks had much higher rates of unemployment thanks to employer discrimination and their positionality, thus in the labor market. Where people tend to go wild is the longer term issues, right? Like Social Security, the Social Security Act exemptions for domestic and agricultural workers who are disproportionately black, and then of course redlining policy. Mm-hmm. And two things that are worth saying about that, or at least two things that we're saying about that. One is that I think it's worth noting that with respect to Social Security, the Social Security Act exemptions, it's really not clear at all that racism was the dominant factor in SSA exemptions. And in fact, those SSA exemptions for domestic and agricultural workers lasted about 15 or so years, right? I mean, it's not 1935 to 1965. It's more like 1935 to about 1950 or 54, right? And that's too long. But the reality of the situation is that the majority of people who were excluded by way of those exemptions for domestic and agricultural workers were white. And in fact, I mean, what contributes to the SSA exemptions comes down to a combination of bureaucracy, because nothing like Social Security had existed before. Like my students often enough, when I've talked about Social Security, the Social Security Act, or shown documentaries on that touch upon Social Security Act, they imagine, they don't see the connection between a Social Security card and Social Security, right? These are like two unrelated things for them. And I think they reverse the order. I think they think that the card came before the policy. It's like, well, WTF, what do you think the point of the card was? But anyway, so the impetus behind those exemptions, though, comes in at least two forms. The bureaucracy associated with that policy, the headaches associated with extending Social Security benefits to agricultural and domestic workers. And if you think about the work that agricultural and domestic workers did, you can appreciate the bureaucratic snafus there. So they really prioritized industry, manufacturing, and commerce. So there are about a dozen occupations that were, when all is said and done, that were exempted from Social Security Act coverage. And a number of those occupations, blacks were a minority, like a pronounced minority, like medical doctor, I think was among them, and maybe merchant marine too. The other piece to that story is that the American Farm Bureau, the major farm lobby at the time, resisted extension of Social Security to agricultural workers and actually the farm owners themselves. They didn't want to pay the tax, right? I mean, a big part of it is that the profit margins were slim enough that they didn't want to pay the tax. And another component of this, their opposition, the agribusiness's opposition, has to do with the fact that they provided their own private welfare system, which they used as a kind of, and it was not good, but nevertheless, they used their own private welfare system as a way to shore up, employee loyalty, right? So even though it's a given that, in the South, most white people in 1935 are racist, it's a given that the discourse around it would have had a racist hue. When you look at where the rubber meets the road, the fact that 74% of the workers who were excluded from the Social Security Act coverage by way of the exemptions for domestic and agricultural workers were white, whereas 23% of the workers who were excluded were black, tells you that it's not mainly about racism, right? Because that would be a hell of a lot of collateral damage. The other thing, though, would be about redlining policy. So first, agribusiness really fought tooth and nail to deny that coverage for the reasons that I've talked about. And in fact, when the coverage was eventually extended to farm owning proprietors in 1954, they fought that too, right? The second thing, though, would be about redlining. And to cut to the quick on that one, since I probably took too long to tell you about the Social Security Act piece, redlining policy took what was best business. The FHA, by way of mortgage policy, which included discriminatory redlining practices, basically took best business practices from the real estate industry and infused it into and made it law, right? And so what I'm getting at with both the exemption, so the real estate industry had already identified before there was an FHA, had already identified race as and the racial integrity of a neighborhood, and of course not even race as we think of it, right? Race, which would include what we think of as ethnicity too, like Jews, Italians, East Europeans, they're part of this mix as well as Blacks and Hispanics. But the real estate industry had already identified, going back to the teens, racial integrity of a neighborhood as a factor in property valuations. And when the new dealers came around to shoring up the banking industry and homeowners alike by way of the HOLC, and then expanding on the support that the HOLC had provided to banks by way of FHA mortgage policy, which creates long-term mortgages, the new dealers brought in representatives from the real estate and banking industry to draft this legislation. So the guy who actually is responsible, if you will, for redlining, which denied Blacks the ability to buy homes on these good FHA 20-year mortgage policies, was a guy named Homer Hoyt, who had been the president of the National Real Estate Association, right? And what I'm getting at, if you put all of this together, people around, I don't know, 2015, let's say, around the Sanders insurgency, some people pointed to, and Ta-Nehisi Coates would have been among them, and this would go back to his case for reparations, pointed to, the discrimination in SSA policy and FHA mortgage policy as evidence of the inherent limitations of universalism. Mm-hmm. And in fact, what those policy problems were illustrative of was not the inherent limitations of kind of social democratic politics, because the New Deal wasn't really social democracy, right? So in 2015, this New Deal was racist thing gained a lot of traction as a way to push back against Sanders, right? But what was going on here is that those exemptions that discriminated against, or at least impacted Blacks disproportionately in the case of SSA exemptions, and discriminated against Blacks institutionally by way of FHA mortgage policy, reflected the New Deal's fundamental endgame of shoring up or righting a listing capitalist economy, right? Because in both cases, this is the New Deal doing what it was about, righting a listing capitalist economy, which meant it was doing right by capital, but doing right by capital in a way that allowed workers to benefit. And even in the case of SSA exemptions for agricultural and domestic workers, you're talking about maybe, again, no more than 19, really, I think for agricultural workers, I think it's 15 years worth of exemption. Just too many years. No question about that. It should have been 0. But ultimately, it's the government that forced that issue, right? I mean, it's because the Farm Bureau opposed extending that coverage to those workers. Mm-hmm. So this is to say that Blacks benefited from the New Deal. They showed their support for the New Deal with their votes. The New Deal would have a transformative impact on Black politics. It would actually push Black Americans to advance, and Paul Prescott writes about this, obviously, in many places, but pushes Black Americans to advance what we would think of as a kind of social democratic politics, right? I mean, Black Americans in the 1930s and 40s tended to view racial discrimination through the lens of class exploitation. Mm-hmm. And it's really easy to understand why they would, because there was no affirmative action at the time. So employers and landlords could say, could post discriminatory policies unambiguously, right? And at the workplace, what that meant practically is that workers could see that employers would pay Blacks and whites different, and different white ethnics too, different rates for doing the same job, right? Mm-hmm. So you could literally see the way that employers used race as a kind of divide and conquer, and of course as a vehicle to depress the wages, not just of Blacks who are, on the lowest rung, but the presence of Blacks in these fields of work who were on the lowest rung, who could do the job, had a depressing effect on the wages of whites, right? And not their psychological wage, but the wage that they took home, paid their rent with, right? So you could literally see that it was transparent, and you could see a version of the same thing in housing. So among the reasons, and there are a lot of reasons that Black Americans, were transformed politically by the New Deal, would be just that, right? Another would be the New Deal certainly pushed working people to advance the cause of working people for the good of capitalism, but also for the good of democracy. So Blacks benefit from the New Deal. It was transformative, but the discriminatory policies, many of them, not all, that one would find in the New Deal, really are in many instances, not all, owed to the New Deal's commitment to capitalism, not to the social democratic impulses informing the New Deal. And in fact, mortgage policy, encouraging Americans to be homeowners rather than building more public housing, like attractive, good public housing, like on the European model, is actually a reflection of the conservative strain of New Deal liberalism, right? Because you're encouraging people to buy into a kind of petty bourgeois status as homeowners, as part of a vehicle for demobilizing a quite militant working class in the post-war era. But if you are buying your house over 20 or 30 years, you're going to spend a hell of a lot of time on some version of a rent-to-own policy. So what's the difference between the bank owning your house until you pay it off, or having a home that's taxpayer funded, that's a great publicly owned, which in a democracy means you own it and all of us own it, having a great publicly owned home.
So Touré, I think what you're saying is breaking up the banks will end racism.
Well, I mean, and I heard you guys talk about that. It's one of my favorite Hillary Clinton quips. And it's one of my favorite because of the irony associated with that. Because her husband's deregulation of the banking industry in 1999, or at least his decision to sign into law a piece of legislation drafted in part by Phil Gramm, deregulating the banking industry, had very much, if not everything, to do with the mortgage crisis that impacted Black Americans disproportionately. And yet she insisted that regulating the banking industry wouldn't do anything to address systemic racism. And she's right. Regulating the banking industry wouldn't do anything to address systemic racism. It would have done, and that's one of the reasons systemic racism is a problematic framework, because it would have done quite a bit to bolster the prospects of those Black people who were impacted disproportionately by the subprime mortgage crisis, as well as those white and brown people who were impacted by it as well.
Well, on that note, I just want to remind everybody that Touré Reed's book is Toward Freedom, The Case Against Class Reductionism. Touré, before you came on, Ariella and I and our producer Kale, we just all had the book sitting next to us. So we were going to embarrass you by all. Oh, yeah, I have mine here.
Cool.
Ariella has.
Can I join you? Yeah. I have it too. Here it is.
Oh, what?
Buy the book.
Yeah.
Club.
But I have so many because my husband edited this book.
That's right.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, that's why.
Awesome.
He was like, ask him this, ask him this, ask him. And I was like, you are being way too specific and complicated.
So you spend time in Louisiana.
Yeah, that's where his family's from. Yeah, I love
Asher
it there.
and I talked about that. Yeah. I don't think Asher will mind me saying this. I had a wonderful experience with Asher, and I've literally recommended him to all of my family and friends as an editor. And he knows that's true. My father has been working with Asher on a book in the aftermath of that. So he knows. I'm very
excited. Asher has read me excerpts of the book and unsolicited, but it's really good. It's really good.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And I really did enjoy the conversation that you guys were having before I was tapped to join you. So it was, you have a great chemistry and good topical stuff. By the way, Jen, I have to ask you before I go, what did you think of Dr. Umar? Because I listened to your, I watched your time with Jason and Pascal. I didn't see that part I missed that part of the exchange. So, had you been familiar with Dr. Umar previously?
No, I didn't know who he was. I think that Jason had played the clip really just to troll Pascal, who like almost lost his mind. It was pretty crazy. I mean, it was a bit much, but I mean, it was a very so just to catch everybody up who's still listening. I went on Jason Miles' podcast, which is called This Is Revolution, and he played a clip from I guess, would you say that this guy identifies as like a Pan-Africanist, or like, I don't know, he's kind of like I get, but I mean, that's almost too gentle for like what he's actually saying, right? Which is kind of like bizarre, like displaced kind of Black African nationalism. And Jason laid the clip on us and we were all just like, hell yeah.
I don't know which clip it was because I didn't ask him, but I hope it wasn't the one where from, I think maybe this past December, when he was taking applications for wifeys.
No, it wasn't that. It wasn't that one. It wasn't that one. It was the one where he was like, Black people built America, like not white people, like not Chinese, not like Arab, not like Native American or like whatever. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is really making me want to watch that show.
Yeah, you should. I
haven't seen it yet. I think so. I think there's a link in the chat that was posted to it. So I'll dig through that and find it.
It was a really good show. And I knew it was coming because I think I connected Jen and Jason via email, but I didn't know the date. But I was on Facebook and I saw that it was live. So I was like, okay, I get to watch this now. So did a great job.
You took a break from Discovery ID.
Right.
I took a break from reading dissertations on a committee that I was on, a dissertation awards committee. So it was quite a pleasant distraction. So I really, really am indebted to you, Jen, for helping to clear my mind for an hour and a half or so before I went back to reading dissertations again.
Get to watch a show, indulge in some Hotep talk. That was another theme of that show. All right. Well, we have kept you for a very long time. Obviously, you'll have to come back at some point so we can continue this theme. But thank you again, Touré.
Well, thank you both, Ariella and Jen. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I had a great time.